Talia felt the water rising before she saw it. One moment, the mangrove roots beneath her hide were dark with mud, and the next they were invisible beneath a surge of black water that seemed to swallow the world whole. She had 40 seconds to decide. Abandon the position she had spent 36 hours constructing, or trust the reinforcements she had built against exactly this scenario. The village lights flickered 200 meters ahead through the rain. Somewhere in that village, a man who had ordered the beheading of 7 hostages was meeting with his lieutenants tonight. She pressed her body deeper into the mangroves and felt the water climb past her ribs. Her rifle stayed above the surface. The water kept rising. Corporal Talia Voss had grown up in the bayous of southern Louisiana, where water was not an enemy, but a neighbor you learned to respect. Her father had been a shrimper who taught her to read the moods of storms the way other children learn to read books. She knew the difference between water that wanted to pass through and water that wanted to take everything with it. This water, surging through the mangrove forest on the coast of Basilan Island, had not yet decided what it wanted to be. She keyed her radio with her left hand while her right kept her M40A6 elevated above the flood. Overwatch 1, this is Viper 2. Water level in my position has risen approximately 4 feet in the last 6 minutes. Requesting guidance on mission status. The response came after a pause that lasted too long. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Calhoun's voice carried the same dismissive tone she had learned to expect over the past 11 months. Viper 2, you are the one in position. Figure it out or extract. Overwatch 1 out. She did not bother responding. Calhoun had made his feelings clear from the day she arrived at the unit. He had given her this position precisely because it was the most exposed to the incoming weather system. The other 3 members of their sniper element were positioned 800 meters inland on higher ground. Safe ground. She was alone in a mangrove swamp with a typhoon bearing down because Gunnery Sergeant Calhoun believed women did not belong in combat roles, and he intended to prove it by watching her fail. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who has faced impossible odds and refused to back down. We would love to hear about them. The water reached her chest and stopped rising. She allowed herself 3 control breaths. The first surge had passed. Her hide, a carefully constructed nest of mangrove branches and camouflage netting woven into the root system, had held. The firing lane she had cleared toward the village remained intact. The waterproof case containing her spare ammunition was still secured to the roots above her head. She had prepared for this. 36 hours of work, accounting for every variable she could imagine, including the storm surge that the meteorological reports had warned about. She thought about Sergeant Danilo Reyes, her Filipino counterpart from the Scout Rangers. Before they had separated to take their positions, she had noticed him rationing his water carefully. His canteen had been nearly empty. Without a word, she had handed him her backup water supply, 2 liters she might need if the mission extended beyond the planned window. He had tried to refuse. She had simply pressed it into his hands and moved toward the mangroves. Some things did not require discussion. Now Reyes was somewhere inland, covering the northern approach to the village, and she was chest deep in flood water, wondering if she would live long enough to regret her generosity. She did not regret it. Her father had taught her that kindness was not weakness. It was the thing that separated people who survived from people who merely existed. Her father. She felt for the compass hanging beneath her ghillie suit, the brass warm against her skin despite the cold water. He had given it to her on her 10th birthday, 3 weeks before Hurricane Katrina took him. She remembered his hands, calloused and strong, showing her how to read the needle. She remembered his voice, calm and steady even as the weather reports grew more urgent. She remembered the last time she saw his face, pushing her onto a neighbor's rooftop as the water rose past his shoulders. He had smiled at her, told her to be brave. Then the current had taken him and she had never seen him again. The memory usually paralyzed her. Tonight she used it as fuel. She was still here, still breathing, still holding her rifle above the water. Her father had not drowned so that she could quit the first time the world tried to wash her away. Through her scope, she scanned the village. The storm had knocked out most of the power, but generator lights flickered in several buildings. The largest structure, a concrete building that served as both meeting hall and mosque, showed activity. Shadows moving behind rain-streaked windows. Her intelligence briefing had indicated that Isnalin Hapalon Jr., son of the deceased Abu Sayyaf leader, would be meeting with his lieutenants tonight to plan their next operation. The storm had provided cover for the meeting. It had also provided cover for her. She settled into the patience that had earned her the highest marksmanship scores in her scout sniper class. The instructors had tried to wash her out. They had made her carry extra weight, given her less sleep, assigned her the worst shooting positions. She had outshot every man in her class anyway. Not because she was trying to prove anything, because shooting was the one thing that had always made sense to her. The mathematics of trajectory and windage, the discipline of breath control, the meditation of waiting for the perfect moment. These things did not care whether she was a woman. They only cared whether she was precise. The rain intensified. She heard something beneath the wind, a sound that did not belong. A low rumble building from the east, growing louder, shaking the mangrove roots around her. She had heard this sound once before when she was 10 years old, clinging to a rooftop in Louisiana. The second surge was coming, and this one sounded bigger than the first. The wall of water hit the mangroves like a freight train made of darkness. Talia had 3 seconds to react. She launched herself upward, fingers clawing at the branches above her head, rifle slung across her back as the surge exploded through her position. The water that had been at her chest was suddenly over her head, and she was climbing blind through a tangle of roots and branches while the current tried to tear her away from everything solid. Her hands found a thick branch, and she pulled herself up with strength she did not know she still possessed. The water roared beneath her, through her, around her, a living thing hungry for anything it could claim. She wedged herself into a fork in the mangrove canopy and wrapped her legs around the trunk as the surge peaked. For 11 seconds that lasted a lifetime, she held on while the storm tried to kill her. Then the water began to recede. Not completely, not enough, but enough that she could breathe without swallowing the sea. Enough that she could take stock of what remained. Her rifle was still on her back. She pulled it around and checked the action, the scope, the barrel. Mud in the barrel. She cleared it with practiced movements, fingers working automatically while her mind calculated the damage. The scope appeared intact. The action cycled smoothly. She had ammunition in the magazine and more in the waterproof case, assuming the case had survived. She looked down at where her hide had been. The carefully constructed nest of branches and netting was gone. 36 hours of work erased in 11 seconds. The firing lane she had cleared was choked with debris. The waterproof case was no longer visible. Everything she had built had been taken by the water, just like the water had taken her father 16 years ago. Her radio crackled. Viper 2, status report. Calhoun's voice carried no concern, only the clipped efficiency of a man checking boxes. She keyed the transmitter. Viper 2 is operational. Position compromised by surge. Assessing options. The pause before his response told her everything she needed to know about his expectations. Viper 2, if your position is compromised, recommend you extract to high ground and leave the primary mission to assets that are actually in position. Acknowledge. She felt the anger rise in her chest and forced it down. Anger was a luxury she could not afford. Negative. Overwatch 1. I am still within operational range of the target. Requesting time to establish secondary position. Another pause. Suit yourself, Corporal. But when this goes sideways, remember that I offered you an out. Overwatch 1 out. She did not respond. There was nothing to say that would change his mind, and she had more important things to do than argue with a man who had already decided she would fail. The memory came unbidden. Scout Sniper School, Week 7, the week they had tried hardest to break her. She had been assigned to a shooting position in a drainage ditch while the male candidates got elevated platforms. The instructor, a master sergeant with 20 years of trigger time, had stood over her and announced to the class that some people were simply not built for this work. Physical limitations, he had said, looking directly at her, cannot be overcome by willpower alone. She had not responded. She had simply settled into her position, controlled her breathing, and put 5 rounds through a target at 800 meters in a grouping tight enough to cover with a silver dollar. The master sergeant had not apologized. He had simply moved on to the next station. But she had seen something shift in the eyes of the men around her. Not respect exactly. Something closer to confusion. The realization that their assumptions might not survive contact with reality. That was all she had ever asked for. Not special treatment. Not lowered standards. Just the chance to prove that the assumptions were wrong. The rain was lessening now, the typhoon's eye wall passing to the north. She had maybe 2 hours before the backside of the storm arrived. 2 hours to find a new position, construct a new hide, and reacquire her target. It should have been impossible, but impossible was just a word people used when they had already decided to quit. She began to move through the canopy, testing each branch before committing her weight, working her way toward a section of the mangroves that might offer better options. The water below her was still chest deep in most places, black and filled with debris. She spotted something pale floating in the current and looked away quickly. A dead pig, probably swept from one of the village farms. For a moment, she had thought it was something else. Someone else. Her father had been a big man. Strong hands, broad shoulders, a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. He had loved 3 things in his life: the sea, his boat, and his daughter. Not necessarily in that order, he used to say, but close. She had learned to navigate by the stars on his shrimp boat, learned to read weather patterns in the color of the sky, learned to be patient, because the sea rewarded patience and punished haste. She had also learned that the sea took what it wanted, and there was nothing you could do except survive long enough to rebuild. The mangrove canopy opened slightly ahead, and she spotted what she was looking for. A collapsed fishing platform, probably destroyed by an earlier storm, wedged into the root system about 150 meters from her original position. The angle to the village would be worse. The concealment would be minimal. But it was something, a foundation she could build on. She was halfway to the platform when she saw it through her scope. The village, illuminated by generator light, and in the window of the largest building, a face she recognized from the intelligence briefings. Iselin Hapalon Jr. He was there. The target was real and present and within range of her rifle. Then the generator light flickered and died, and the village disappeared into darkness. The backside of the storm was coming early. She had less time than she thought. She pushed forward through the canopy, ignoring the branches that tore her ghillie suit, ignoring the exhaustion that pulled at her muscles, ignoring everything except the fishing platform ahead and the rifle on her back and a man in that village who had ordered the deaths of innocents. Dawn would come in 4 hours. By then, she would either have a position or she would have nothing. There was no third option. Dawn came gray and hostile, the sky bruised with clouds that promised more rain before the day was finished. Talia had not slept. She had spent the remaining hours of darkness reaching the collapsed fishing platform and assessing what she had to work with. The answer was almost nothing. The platform was a skeleton of rotted wood and rusted metal, half submerged in the receding floodwaters. Whatever structure had once stood here had been reduced to a tangle of debris that offered concealment only if she buried herself within it. The angle to the village was worse than she had feared. Her original position had given her a clear line to 3 of the 4 main buildings. From here, she could only see 2, and the largest building, the one where she had glimpsed Hapalon, was partially obscured by a concrete wall that had not been visible from her previous vantage point. She would have to take her shot through a window no larger than a dinner plate, at a range of 220 meters, with a scope that might have been damaged by the surge. The margin for error was measured in millimeters. She began to build anyway. The debris from the storm became her construction materials. Branches torn from the mangroves, sheets of corrugated metal ripped from village roofs, tangles of fishing net that had washed into the root system. She worked methodically, each piece placed with purpose creating a nest that would hide her thermal signature and break up the outline of her body. The ghillie suit helped, but fabric alone would not be enough. She needed depth, layers, the illusion of emptiness where a Marine with a rifle actually waited. Her hands were bleeding by the time the sun climbed high enough to burn through the clouds. She ignored the pain. Pain was information, nothing more. It told her that her body was still functioning, still capable of the work that needed to be done. She had felt worse pain during Scout Sniper School, during the weeks when they had pushed her past every limit she thought she had. This was just blood. Blood could be cleaned later. She checked her ammunition count. The magazine in her rifle held 5 rounds. Her backup magazine had been in the waterproof case. The waterproof case was somewhere beneath 6 feet of muddy water, probably buried in debris, effectively lost. 5 rounds. 5 chances to complete a mission that would justify everything she had endured to reach this moment. Her radio crackled with a morning check-in. All Viper elements, report status. Viper 1, operational, came to first response. That was Sergeant Castellano, Calhoun's favorite, positioned on the high ground with a perfect angle and a spotter to call his shots. Viper 3, operational. Corporal Webb, another member of the boys' club, equally comfortable and equally supported. Viper 2, operational. She kept her voice flat, professional, revealing nothing of the night she had survived or the impossible situation she was building her way out of. Calhoun's voice came last. Copy all. Intelligence update. Target meeting is confirmed for this evening. Estimated time is 1800 local. All elements maintain position and await further guidance. Overwatch 1 out. 6 hours. She had 6 hours to complete her hide, verify her scope, calculate her new firing solution, and prepare for a shot that would either validate her entire career or end it. She allowed herself 30 seconds to feel the weight of that reality. Then she went back to work. It was mid-morning when she found the shell casings. They were half buried in the mud near the base of the fishing platform, 3 brass cylinders that did not belong to any weapon in the American inventory. She picked one up and examined it. 7.62 by 54 millimeter. Russian caliber. The brass was not weathered, not corroded. These casings were fresh. Someone had fired a Russian caliber rifle from very close to this position within the last few days. She scanned the surrounding mangroves with new eyes. The storm had erased most traces, but now that she knew what to look for, she could see the signs. Broken branches at a height consistent with a prone shooting position. Disturbed mud in a pattern that suggested careful movement. A small clearing in the vegetation that would have provided a sight line to the village before the debris shifted. Someone else was hunting Hapalon. Someone who was not American, not Filipino, not part of any operation she had been briefed on. Someone with Russian weapons and enough skill to build a hide in the same location she had chosen. The implications cascaded through her mind. A competing sniper team meant complications. If they took the shot first, months of intelligence work would be wasted. If they missed and alerted the target, her mission would become impossible. If they were still in the area, she might find herself in a confrontation she was not equipped to win. She pocketed the shell casings and continued building, one problem at a time. Right now, the problem was concealment. The competing sniper team would become a problem later, assuming they had survived the storm, assuming they were still operational, assuming a dozen other variables she could not control. Her hide took shape through the morning. It was uglier than her first construction, more improvised, less elegant. But it would work. The layers of debris broke up her silhouette. The fishing net, draped and woven through the wreckage, created depth that would fool casual observation. The shooting position itself was cramped and uncomfortable, but it gave her the angle she needed to that narrow window. She settled into the hide and raised her rifle. The scope showed the village in sharp detail. She could see villagers moving through the streets, beginning the work of cleaning up after the storm. She could see armed men, Hapalon's guards, patrolling in pairs with the casual arrogance of people who believed they were untouchable. She could see the window of the meeting building, empty for now, waiting for the evening gathering. Then she saw something else. movement in the mangroves to her east, a shape that did not belong. Human, armed, moving with the careful discipline of someone who knew how to stay hidden. The competing team was not gone. They were repositioning, and they were moving toward an angle that would give them a clear shot at the same window she was watching. She had 6 hours until the meeting. The other team would be in position long before then, and she had no way to warn anyone without revealing her own location. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. She could complete her mission, or she could survive the competing team. Doing both would require something close to a miracle. The afternoon heat turned the mangroves into a steam bath. Talia remained motionless in her hide, sweat tracing lines down her face, her eye pressed to the scope as she tracked the movement in the eastern tree line. The competing sniper team had stopped. They were building their own position now, approximately 300 meters from her location, working with the efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. She counted 2 figures, a shooter and a spotter, the standard configuration. Their weapons were difficult to identify at this distance, but the way they moved suggested military training. Not insurgents, not amateurs. These were operators, possibly Indonesian special forces based on the Russian caliber ammunition, possibly mercenaries hired by a competing faction within the sprawling archipelago of militant groups that infested these islands. It did not matter who they were. What mattered was that they were here, and they wanted the same target she wanted, and there was nothing she could do about it without compromising her own position. She forced herself to look away from the eastern threat and focus on the village. The meeting was still 4 hours away. For hours of waiting, of watching, of calculating variables that refused to stay constant. Her body ached from a night in the water, from the hours of construction, from the sustained tension that had become her baseline state. She needed food. She needed sleep. She would get neither until this was finished. Movement in the village drew her attention. A patrol of 5 armed men emerged from between 2 buildings and began walking the perimeter, their routes taking them along the edge of the mangroves. Standard security sweep. They would pass within 30 meters of her position if they maintained their current heading. She controlled her breathing and became part of the debris. The ghillie suit and her improvised hide transformed her into a shadow, a trick of light and vegetation, something the eye would pass over without recognition. The patrol walked closer. She could hear their voices now, speaking Tausug, the local dialect, complaining about the storm damage and the extra duty it had created. One of the men stopped. He was younger than the others, barely out of his teens, with an AK pattern rifle slung carelessly across his chest. He was looking at the mangroves, looking at her section of the mangroves. His eyes swept across her position, and she felt the moment stretch into eternity. He saw nothing. His gaze moved on. He said something to his companions that made them laugh, and the patrol continued along its route, their voices fading into the humid air. She released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Close. Too close. The debris from the storm had changed the visual patterns of the mangrove edge, and her hide was newer than the surrounding environment. Another patrol might notice the inconsistency. She needed to age her position, add more storm debris to the outer layers, make it look like something the water had built rather than something human hands had constructed. But she could not move until the patrol was out of sight. She waited. Patience was not a virtue in this work. It was a survival requirement. Her radio clicked twice. The signal from Sergeant Reyes. He was alive and trying to make contact without revealing his position to anyone monitoring the frequency. She clicked back 3 times. Acknowledged. Standing by. The radio silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then Reyes came through on the backup frequency they had established during mission planning, his voice barely above a whisper. Viper 2, I have eyes on your position from the north. Also have eyes on unknown element to your east. What is your situation? She kept her response equally quiet. Viper 2 is operational. Unknown element appears to be competing asset, possibly Indonesian. They are establishing position for the same target. Another pause. Reyes was thinking, calculating, doing the same mathematics she had already done. Then his voice came back with information that changed everything. I have additional intelligence. Meeting time has moved. Target gathering is now at 1600. Repeat, 1600. 2 hours. The meeting had been moved up by 2 hours. Her window for preparation had just been cut in half. She processed the implications. The competing team probably did not have this information. They were building their position based on the original timeline, taking their time, ensuring everything was perfect. If the meeting happened at 1600, they might not be ready. But she might not be ready either. Copy, she responded. How confident is your source? Reyes did not hesitate. Very confident. My cousin works in the village. She saw them preparing the building. They're expecting visitors soon. His cousin. The same cousin whose daughter had been taken by Hapalon's men 2 years ago. The same cousin who had fed them intelligence throughout the planning phase of this operation. Reyes had personal stakes in this mission that went beyond duty or patriotism. His family had been touched by the violence these men created, and he wanted them stopped with a ferocity that matched her own determination. Understood, she said. I will be ready. She ended the transmission and began working faster. The hide needed to be completed. Her scope needed to be verified. Her firing solution needed to be calculated for the new conditions. 2 hours to do work that should have taken 4. The sky was darkening again in the west. Not the deep black of the typhoon, but the gray promise of heavy rain. The back edge of the storm system was circling around for another pass. If it hit before 1600, visibility would drop to nothing. If it hit during the meeting, her shot would become exponentially more difficult. She worked through the scenarios as her hands continued their tasks. Rain would affect the competing team as well. It might delay the meeting further. It might provide cover for her extraction after the shot. There were too many variables, too many possibilities, too many ways for this to go wrong. But there was also one way for it to go right. One perfect alignment of skill and timing and luck that would put her bullet exactly where it needed to be. That was the outcome she focused on. That was the only outcome that mattered. The clouds continued to build. The competing team continued to work. The village continued its recovery. And somewhere in that concrete building, a man who had ordered the deaths of innocents was preparing to meet with his lieutenants, unaware that 2 different rifles were being aimed at his future. Talia finished the last adjustment to her hide and settled into her shooting position. Her rifle was ready. Her mind was clear. Her father's compass pressed against her chest like a promise. 2 hours. Everything she had survived would come down to what happened in the next 2 hours. The rain began at 15:30, not the gentle rain of a passing shower, but the hammering downpour of a tropical system that had decided to remind everyone who was truly in control. Within minutes, visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. The village disappeared behind a curtain of water, so thick it seemed solid. Talia watched her mission dissolve into gray nothing. She could not take a shot she could not see. The meeting might be happening right now, Hapalon and his lieutenants gathering in that concrete building, and she was blind. Completely, utterly blind. The scope showed her nothing but rain and the vague shadows of mangrove branches whipping in the wind. Her radio crackled. Viper 2, Overwatch 1. What is your visual on target building? She keyed the transmitter. Viper 2 has 0 visibility. Rain is too heavy. Cannot confirm target presence. Calhoun's response carried something that might have been satisfaction. Copy that, Viper 2. Viper 1 reports same conditions. Mission may need to be scrubbed. Stand by for further guidance. Scrubbed. Months of intelligence work, weeks of planning, days of infiltration, and it would all be scrubbed because of rain. She felt the frustration building in her chest and forced it down. The weather did not care about her frustration. The weather did not care about anything. She was adjusting her position to wait out the storm when she heard it. A sound beneath the rain, beneath the wind, beneath everything else. The same low rumble she had heard twice before. The sound of water moving with purpose. No, not again. She looked toward the coast and saw the surge coming through the mangroves. Not as large as the previous waves, but large enough. Large enough to destroy everything she had rebuilt. Large enough to take her rifle, her ammunition, her mission. Large enough to kill her if she was not fast enough. She grabbed her rifle and launched herself out of the hide just as the water hit. The surge caught her legs and spun her sideways, slamming her into a mangrove trunk with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. She wrapped her arms around the tree and held on as the water rose past her waist, past her chest, past her shoulders. Her rifle was still in her hands. She would not let go of the rifle. She would die before she let go of the rifle. The water kept rising. It reached her chin. She tilted her head back and gasped for air as the flood tried to swallow her whole. The current was stronger than before, fed by the rain, angry with the energy of the storm. It pulled at her legs, her arms, her body, demanding that she surrender to its power. She thought of her father. She thought of his face in the water, his smile as the current took him, his sacrifice so that she could live. She had been 10 years old, clinging to a rooftop, watching the only person who had ever truly loved her disappear into the brown flood of Hurricane Katrina. She had screamed until her throat bled. She had reached for him until her arms gave out. She had promised herself that she would never feel that helpless again. But she felt it now. The same helplessness, the same terror, the same certainty that the water was going to win and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The surge peaked. 4-3 eternal seconds. She was completely submerged, holding her breath, holding her rifle, holding onto the tree with strength that came from somewhere beyond her muscles. Then the water began to drop, slowly at first, then faster, draining back toward the coast, leaving her gasping and shaking and alive. She coughed water from her lungs and looked for her hide. It was gone. Again. The fishing platform had been torn apart by the surge, scattered across the mangroves like kindling. Her carefully constructed concealment had been erased for the second time in 24 hours. She had nothing. No position. No backup ammunition. No communication. She realized, as she checked her radio and found it dead from water damage. She was alone. Truly alone. Cut off from her team. Cut off from Reyes. Cut off from everything except the rifle in her hands and the mission that still waited in the village ahead. The rain began to ease. The sky lightened from black to gray to something approaching visibility. She raised her scope and looked toward the village, expecting to see nothing, expecting to find that the meeting had concluded, the target had escaped, the entire operation had failed. Instead, she saw lights, generator lights, flickering back to life in the concrete building, shadows moving behind the windows. The meeting had not started yet. The storm had delayed them just as it had delayed her. She had another chance, one more chance to complete what she had started. But she had no hide, no concealment, no position from which to take her shot. The mangroves around her were devastated, stripped bare by the surge, offering nothing that could shield her from observation. If she tried to shoot from here, she would be seen. If she was seen, she would be killed. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Then she saw it, 50 meters ahead, closer to the village than she had ever intended to go. A tangle of debris had collected against a partially submerged concrete structure, probably the foundation of a building destroyed in an earlier typhoon. The debris pile was large enough to hide in. The angle to the target building was nearly direct. It was exposed, dangerous, far too close to the village for comfort. It was also her only option. She began to move through the flooded mangroves, her rifle held above the water, her body screaming with exhaustion and cold and the accumulated trauma of the past 24 hours. The debris pile grew larger as she approached. The village grew closer. The generator lights grew brighter. Somewhere in that building, Hapalon was waiting, and somewhere behind her, the competing sniper team was probably facing the same devastation she had just survived. The surge had reset everything. The next hour would determine who recovered faster. Talia reached the debris pile and began to dig herself a position. She had no time for elegance, no time for careful construction. She had only time for survival and one perfect shot. The debris pile smelled of rot and salt and something chemical that burned her nostrils. Talia did not care. She burrowed into the tangle of storm wreckage like an animal seeking shelter, her hands tearing at corrugated metal and splintered wood until she had carved out a space large enough for her body and her rifle. The concealment was terrible. The position was exposed. It was also the only thing standing between her and complete mission failure. She settled into the hollow she had created and raised her scope to her eye. The crack in the lens was worse than she had realized. The surge had driven mud into the housing, and when she wiped it clear, she could see that the fracture now extended across nearly a quarter of the glass. The image through the scope was distorted on the left side, warped in a way that would throw off her calculations if she did not compensate. She would compensate. She had no other choice. The village was close now, close enough that she could hear voices when the wind died down, close enough that she could smell cooking fires and generator exhaust, close enough that a single mistake would bring armed men swarming toward her position within seconds. She had maybe 60 meters of open ground between her debris pile and the nearest building. If she had to run, she would not make it. She pushed that thought aside and focused on the target building. The concrete structure was clearly visible now, its windows glowing with yellow light. She could see movement inside, multiple figures. The meeting was assembling. Then she saw him. Hapalon Jr. stepped into view, framed perfectly in the window she had been watching. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with a thin beard and eyes that carried the flat certainty of a true believer. He was gesturing to someone outside her field of view, his movements animated, confident. He had no idea that a rifle was pointed at his chest from 50 meters away. She began her breathing sequence. For counts in, hold for 4. For counts out. Her heart rate slowed. Her hands steadied. The world narrowed to the circle of her scope and the man standing in its center. Then a woman walked into the frame. She was young, perhaps early 20s, wearing a hijab and carrying something in her arms. A bundle wrapped in cloth. The bundle moved, and Talia realized what she was seeing. A baby. The woman was carrying a baby, and she was standing directly in front of Hapalon, blocking any shot that Talia might take. The woman turned slightly, and Talia saw her face. She was not a hostage. Her expression carried no fear, no desperation. She looked at Hapalon with the easy familiarity of family. This was his wife. The baby was his child. Talia's finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger. She could not take the shot. The angle was wrong. The woman was too close to the target. Any bullet that passed through Hapalon might continue into the woman, into the child. The rules of engagement were clear. Collateral damage involving women and children was unacceptable unless directly threatened by the target. She was not directly threatened. She was watching a man stand with his family, and she could not shoot him without risking them. The scope shifted as she searched for another angle, another option. That was when she saw the competing sniper team. They had survived the surge. They had repositioned, and they were set up on a rooftop at the eastern edge of the village, approximately 200 meters from the target building. From their angle, they would have a different shot. A shot that might pass through the wife to reach the husband. A shot that would kill an innocent woman and her child to eliminate a terrorist. She could see their spotter adjusting a rangefinder. She could see the shooter settling into position. They were preparing to fire. Her mind raced through the options. She could not warn anyone. Her radio was dead. She could not signal the competing team. They would not understand, and even if they did, they might not care. She could not take her own shot without risking the woman and child. She was paralyzed, trapped between her mission and her conscience, watching a tragedy prepare to unfold. A voice broke through her spiral. Talia. She nearly jumped out of her skin. Someone was beside her. Someone had crawled through the debris and was lying in the mud less than 2 feet from her position. She turned her head and found herself staring into the face of Sergeant Danilo Reyes. He was soaked in filthy and bleeding from a cut above his eye. He was also smiling. Your radio went dead, he whispered. I thought you might need a spotter. She stared at him. You left your position. I left my position, he confirmed. Court-martial me later. Right now, tell me what we're dealing with. She explained in rapid whispers. the wife, the baby, the competing team, the impossible geometry of the situation. Reyes listened without interrupting, his eyes moving between her scope and the village, processing the information with the calm efficiency of a professional. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. The Indonesian team does not have our intelligence. They do not know about the wife. They will take any shot they can get, and they will not care who else dies. I know, she said. So we have two problems. We need to take the shot before they do, and we need the wife to move. She looked at him. She could not tell if he was serious. How exactly do you propose we make that happen? Reyes reached into his vest and pulled out a small object. A radio. Backup unit. Short range, but functional. He had carried it through the surge, kept it dry, brought it to her when she needed it most. My cousin is in the village, he said. She can get a message to someone inside the building. Create a reason for the wife to step away from the window. The risk was enormous. If his cousin was caught, she would be killed. If the message was intercepted, the entire meeting would scatter. If anything went wrong, they would lose the target and possibly their lives. But the alternative was watching an innocent woman die. Talia looked at Reyes. She saw the determination in his eyes, the same determination that had driven him to abandon his position and crawl through a storm surge to reach her. He was not asking for permission. He was offering her a choice. She made it. Do it, she said, and be ready to call my shot when the window opens. Reyes nodded and keyed the radio. The next few minutes would determine everything. The minutes crawled past like wounded animals. Talia kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching the window, watching the wife, watching the Indonesian team on the rooftop 200 meters away. Beside her, Reyes whispered into the radio, his voice so low she could barely hear the words, even from inches away. The wife had not moved. She stood near Hapalon, the baby cradled against her chest, occasionally shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She seemed comfortable, content, unaware that multiple rifles were aimed at the building where she stood with her child. Talia thought about the woman's face. Young, peaceful. She had probably grown up in a village like this one, married a man her family chose, born a child because that was what women in her world did. She might not know the full extent of her husband's crimes. She might know and accept them as the cost of survival in a brutal environment. It did not matter. What mattered was that she was innocent, and her child was innocent, and neither of them deserved to die for the sins of the man standing beside them. Reyes finished his transmission and lowered the radio. Message sent. My cousin will do what she can. What exactly did you ask her to do? Talia asked. Create a distraction. Something that will draw the wife away from the window without alerting Hapalon. She knows the household. She knows the routines. She will find a way. Talia wanted to ask more questions. She wanted to know the details, the contingencies, the backup plans. But there was no time. The Indonesian spotter was making final adjustments. Their shooter was settling into position with the patience of a professional preparing to take a life. They would fire within minutes, maybe seconds. Tell me about your cousin, Talia said. The words surprised her. This was not the time for conversation, but she needed something to anchor her, something human to hold on to while she waited for the moment that would define everything. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of memory. Her name is Lorna. She is 3 years older than me. When we were children, she used to protect me from the older boys in our village. She was fierce. Still is. She married a fisherman when she was 17. They had a daughter named Maria. Had, Talia repeated. Reyes nodded. Hapalon's men took Maria 2 years ago. She was 15. They held her for ransom, but my cousin's husband could not pay. He tried to rescue her himself. They killed him and sent Maria's body back in pieces. The words hung in the humid air between them. Talia understood now why Reyes had abandoned his position, why he had crawled through a storm surge to reach her, why he was willing to risk his cousin's life to complete this mission. This was not about duty. This was about justice. This was about a 15-year-old girl named Maria who had been murdered by the man standing in that window. I am sorry, Talia said. Do not be sorry, Reyes replied. Be accurate. She turned back to her scope. The wife was still in position. The baby had fallen asleep against her chest. Hapalon was speaking to his lieutenants, his gestures becoming more emphatic. The meeting was progressing. Whatever they were planning would soon be decided. Moving on the rooftop, the Indonesian shooter adjusted his position slightly, his barrel tracking toward the window. His spotter raised a hand, preparing to give a signal. They were out of time. Then the wife turned. Something had caught her attention. A sound from deeper in the building, a voice calling her name. She said something to Hapalon and walked toward the interior doorway, the baby still in her arms. She stepped out of the window frame. She stepped out of the line of fire. The window was clear. Hapalon stood alone, his profile perfectly visible, his chest centered in Talia's scope. Now, Reyes whispered. Wind is 3 miles per hour from the east. Range is 52 meters. You're slightly elevated. Adjust 0.3 minutes down. Talia made the adjustment automatically, her hands moving with the precision of 10,000 practice rounds. The crack in her scope distorted the left edge of the image, but Hapalon was centered. She could work around the damage. She could make this shot. She began her breathing sequence. For counts in. Hold. For counts out. Her finger moved from the trigger guard to the trigger. The world collapsed to a single point of focus. The man in the window, the rifle in her hands, the space between heartbeats, where everything became still. On the rooftop, the Indonesian spotter dropped his hand. Their shooter began to squeeze. Talia fired first. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The sound split the humid air. The bullet crossed 52 meters in a fraction of a second and found its target with the precision of a lifetime of training. Hapalon dropped. The wife screamed from somewhere inside the building. The baby began to cry. Armed men rushed toward the windows, their weapons raised, their eyes searching for the source of the shot. The Indonesian team held their fire, their target already fallen, their mission completed by someone else. We need to move, Reyes said. Now, Talia was already breaking down her position, collapsing the debris around her, erasing the evidence of her presence. She had taken a shot. She had completed the mission. But she was 50 meters from a village full of armed men who now knew that a sniper was somewhere in the mangroves. The extraction had just become the most dangerous part of the operation. She followed Reyes into the flooded forest, her rifle clutched against her chest, her heart pounding with the aftermath of the shot. Behind her, the village erupted into chaos. Voices shouting, engines starting, the hunt beginning. She had killed the man who ordered Maria's death. Now she had to survive long enough for it to matter. The mangroves had become a maze of shadows and floodwater. Talia moved through them with Reyes at her side, their bodies low, their movements deliberate. Behind them, the village was alive with activity. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. Voices shouted coordinates in Tausig. The sound of boat engines growled to life along the shoreline. They were being hunted. Reyes led the way, his knowledge of the local terrain guiding them through channels she would never have found on her own. The water was waist-deep in most places, chest-deep in others, and the current from the receding surge still pulled at their legs with every step. She kept her rifle elevated, the barrel pointing skyward, her arms burning with the effort of keeping the weapon dry. "How far to the extraction point?" she whispered. 800 meters, Reyes replied. "Maybe more. The flooding has changed everything." 800 meters. In normal conditions, they could cover that distance in 15 minutes. In these conditions, hunted by men who knew this terrain far better than she did, it might as well have been 800 miles. A flashlight beam swept across the mangroves 30 meters to their left. Talia froze. Reyes froze. They became statues in the water, shadows among shadows, trusting the darkness and the chaos to hide them. The beam passed over their position without stopping. The searcher moved on. They continued forward. The radio on Reyes's vest crackled with static, then resolved into a voice. "Viper 2, Overwatch 1. Report status immediately." Calhoun. He had heard the shot. The entire team had heard the shot. They knew the mission was complete. They did not know if she was alive. Reyes handed her the radio. She keyed the transmitter and spoke as quietly as she could manage. Overwatch 1, Viper 2. Target is neutralized. Currently evading pursuit en route to extraction point. The pause before Calhoun's response stretched for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice was tight with something she could not identify. Copy, Viper 2. Extraction birds are spinning up. ETA to rally point is approximately 20 minutes. Can you make it? She looked at Reyes. He nodded once. Affirmative, Overwatch 1. Viper 2 out. She handed the radio back to Reyes, and they pushed forward. The mangroves thinned slightly as they moved north, the floodwater giving way to mud and debris. The footing became treacherous, each step threatening to send them sprawling into the muck. But the darkness was deeper here, the searchers' flashlights more distant. They were pulling ahead. Then Reyes stopped. He held up a fist, the universal signal to halt. She froze behind him, her eyes scanning the darkness for whatever he had seen. Patrol, he breathed. 20 meters ahead. 3 men. She could see them now, silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, moving through the mangroves in a search pattern. They were between her and the extraction point. They were also between her and survival. She assessed the options. They could wait for the patrol to pass, but that would cost them time they did not have. They could try to go around, but the flooding limited their routes. They could engage, but 3 against 2 with her down to 4 rounds in her rifle was not a calculation she liked. Reyes touched her arm. He pointed to the left, where a deeper channel cut through the mangroves. The water there would be over their heads. They would have to swim. She nodded. Swimming meant risking her rifle. It meant risking everything. But staying here meant certain discovery. They slipped into the channel together. The water closed over her head immediately, black and cold, and filled with debris. She kicked forward, one hand keeping her rifle above the surface, the other pulling her through the current. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed. She pushed through it all, focused on nothing except the far side of the channel and the promise of air. She surfaced gasping, Reyes beside her, both of them dragging themselves onto a muddy bank that offered minimal cover. The patrol was behind them now, still searching the area they had just left. They had made it through, but the exertion had cost them. Her arms were shaking with fatigue. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The accumulated exhaustion of the past 36 hours was demanding payment, and she had nothing left to give. Reyes looked at her with concern. Can you continue? She met his eyes. She thought about Maria, the girl who had been murdered. She thought about her father, who had died so she could live. She thought about every instructor who had told her she did not belong, every commander who had dismissed her, every moment when she had been expected to fail. I can continue, she said. They pushed forward. The extraction point was close now. She could almost feel the vibration of helicopter rotors in the air, though she knew the birds were still minutes away. The mangroves opened into a clearing ahead, a patch of relatively solid ground that had been designated as the rally point weeks ago during mission planning. They were going to make it. The shot came from nowhere. The bullet cracked past her head, so close she felt the air displacement against her cheek. She dropped flat, her rifle coming up instinctively, her eyes searching for the source. Reyes was beside her, already scanning, already calculating. Rooftop, he said, 200 meters south. The Indonesian team. They had followed. Whether for revenge or simply to eliminate witnesses, the competing sniper team had tracked them through the mangroves and was now positioned between them and extraction. She had 4 rounds. They had the high ground and the angle. The mathematics were impossible, but she had not come this far to die in the mud. She raised her rifle and began to calculate. The mud was cold against her chest. Talia pressed herself flat, making her body as small a target as possible while her mind worked through the geometry of survival. The Indonesian team had elevation and position. She had 4 rounds and a cracked scope. The only advantage she possessed was that they did not know exactly where she was. Yet, Reyes was 3 meters to her left, equally flat, equally exposed. He caught her eye and gestured toward a fallen tree, trunk 10 meters ahead. Cover. If they could reach it, they would have something between themselves and the rooftop. She nodded. On 3, she mouthed. He understood. She held up one finger. 2, 3. They moved together, scrambling through the mud on elbows and knees, keeping as low as physically possible. Another shot cracked overhead, close enough to shower them with splinters from a mangrove branch. The shooter was adjusting, finding their position, zeroing in. She dove behind a fallen trunk and rolled on her back, gasping for air. Reyes crashed down beside her, his chest heaving. They had cover, but it was temporary. The Indonesian team would reposition. They would find an angle. They would finish what they had started. I could draw their fire, Reyes said. Give you time to flank. She shook her head. You will be dead before I get halfway there. Then we wait for extraction. They will reposition before the birds arrive. We will be exposed. He knew she was right. She could see it in his eyes. They were trapped between impossible options, and every second that passed brought the enemy closer to a killing shot. She raised her head just enough to peer over the trunk. The rooftop was visible in the moonlight, a dark shape against the darker sky. She could see the outline of the shooter prone at the roof's edge. The spotter was beside him, scanning with what looked like night vision equipment. Professional, disciplined, patient, but they had made a mistake. They had positioned themselves for a shot at the clearing, expecting their targets to continue toward the extraction point. They had not accounted for the possibility that their targets might shoot back. Talia studied the angle. 200 meters. Uphill, partially obscured by vegetation. A nearly impossible shot with a damaged scope in low light conditions. Nearly impossible was not the same as impossible. She turned to Reyes. I need you to spot for me. He stared at her. You cannot make that shot. I have to try. Talia, the scope is damaged. The light is terrible. You are exhausted. The odds do not matter. She cut him off, her voice harder than she intended. If I do not take this shot, we both die. If I miss, we both die. But if I hit, we live. Those are the only numbers that matter right now. Reyes was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded and shifted position, bringing his spotting scope to bear on the distant rooftop. Wind is negligible, he said. Range is approximately 210 meters. Target is prone, minimal profile. You will need to account for the upward angle. Adjust approximately 0.4 minutes up. She made the adjustment, her fingers moving by instinct. The crack in her scope warped the left side of the image, but the shooter was centered. She could see him clearly enough. She could see the rifle in his hands, the slight movement of his head as he scanned for targets. She began her breathing sequence. The same sequence she had used 1,000 times in training. The same sequence she had used an hour ago when she killed Hapalon. For counts in. Hold for 4. For counts out. Her heart rate slowed. Her hand steadied. The world contracted to a single point of focus. The shooter on the rooftop shifted. He had seen something. His rifle was tracking toward the fallen tree trunk where she and Reyes were hiding. Now, Reyes whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The bullet crossed 210 meters of darkness and found its mark. The shooter on the rooftop jerked once and went still. His spotter reacted instantly, rolling away from the body, reaching for his own weapon. Talia worked the bolt and fired again. The second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He tumbled off the roof and disappeared into the darkness below. 2 shots, 2 hits, 3 rounds remaining. The clearing was silent, except for the distant sound of helicopter rotors growing closer. Go, Reyes said. Now, before anyone else comes. They broke from cover and sprinted toward the extraction point. The mud sucked at their boots, tried to hold them back, but nothing could hold them now. They had survived the storm. They had survived the mission. They had survived each other's impossible choices. The helicopters appeared over the tree line, their rotors beating the air into submission. Talia could see the door gunners scanning the perimeter, the crew chief waving them forward. She ran harder than she had ever run, her lungs burning, her legs screaming, her rifle clutched against her chest like a lifeline. They reached the clearing just as the first bird touched down. The rotor wash hit her like a wall, nearly knocking her off her feet. She pushed through it, grabbed the skid, and hauled herself into the cabin. Reyes was right behind her, collapsing onto the metal floor beside her. The helicopter lifted off before the doors were closed. The village lights fell away beneath them, growing smaller, growing distant, growing irrelevant. They were airborne. They were alive. Talia lay on the floor of the helicopter and stared at the ceiling, her chest heaving, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for 36 hours. She had done it. Against every odd, against every obstacle, against every person who had expected her to fail, she had completed the mission. Then she saw Gunnery Sergeant Calhoun standing at the front of the cabin, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The mission was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The helicopter banked hard over the coastline, leaving Basilan Island behind in a wash of rotor noise and salt air. Talia remained on the floor, her back against the cabin wall, her rifle across her knees. Reyes sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the shared silence did not already communicate. Calhoun had not moved from his position at the front of the cabin. His eyes had not left her face since she climbed aboard. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on the exhaustion that threatened to swallow her whole. The door gunner passed her a canteen. She drank without tasting, the water washing the salt and mud from her throat. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed until now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the wreckage of a body that had been pushed far beyond its limits. The helicopter began its descent 20 minutes later. Through the open door, she could see the lights of the forward operating base, the controlled chaos of a military installation in the middle of the night. Vehicles were moving. Personnel were gathering. Word had spread that the mission was complete. They touched down on a landing pad lit by harsh white floodlights. Talia forced herself to stand, forced her legs to carry her out of the cabin, forced her spine to remain straight despite every muscle screaming for rest. Marines did not stumble off helicopters. Marines walked with purpose, regardless of what they had endured. Calhoun was beside her before her boots hit the ground. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. You disobeyed a direct order. She kept walking. I completed the mission. I told you to extract. I told you the position was compromised. You ignored a direct command from your superior officer. She stopped and turned to face him. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across his features, turning his face into a mask of angles and darkness. She was too tired for fear, too tired for diplomacy, too tired for anything except the truth. The position was compromised, she said, so I built a new one, and another one after that, and another one after that. I completed the mission because that is what Marines do. If you want to court-martial me for succeeding where you expected me to fail, go ahead. File your paperwork. But we both know what this is really about, and it has nothing to do with orders. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or anger. She did not care which. A new voice cut through the tension. Corporal Voss. She turned. A man in Philippine Army uniform was approaching, his rank insignia marking him as a colonel. Beside him walked a Marine major she did not recognize. Both men were looking at her with expressions that did not match Calhoun's hostility. The colonel reached her first. He extended his hand, and she shook it automatically, muscle memory overriding exhaustion. I am Colonel Bautista, Philippine Intelligence. I have been monitoring your operation. He smiled. The expression warm despite the formal setting. That was the finest piece of precision shooting I have witnessed in 15 years of counterterrorism work. One shot. Clean. No collateral damage. You eliminated a target that has cost my country hundreds of lives. She did not know how to respond. Thank you, sir, seemed inadequate. The Marine major spoke next. Corporal, I am Major Henderson, liaison to JSOC. We have been tracking the Hapalon network for 18 months. Your action tonight has disrupted their entire Basilan operation. The intelligence value alone is immeasurable. Calhoun stepped forward. With respect, sir, there are significant concerns about how this mission was conducted. Corporal Voss ignored direct orders to extract. She operated without authorization in a compromised position. There are serious questions about. Colonel Bautista raised a hand, cutting him off. Gunnery Sergeant, I watched your communications in real time. I heard you order this Marine to abandon her mission because her position was difficult. You let the word hang in the air. I also heard you assign her that position in the first place, knowing the weather conditions, knowing she would be isolated, knowing she would face challenges that your other shooters would not. Calhoun's jaw tightened. I made tactical decisions based on... You made decisions based on something other than tactics. The colonel's voice had lost its warmth. I have seen this before. Leaders who cannot accept certain people in certain roles. Leaders who create conditions for failure and then blame the person who was set up to fail. He turned back to Talia. What I saw tonight was a Marine who refused to accept those conditions, who rebuilt her position not once but twice, who completed an impossible mission while her leadership offered no support. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Talia saw Calhoun's face cycle through emotions. Anger, denial, something that might have been the first crack of doubt. Major Henderson cleared his throat. Corporal Voss, you should know that Sergeant Reyes has already provided a preliminary debrief. He spoke highly of your professionalism under extreme conditions. He also mentioned certain decisions made by your team leader that merit further review. Talia glanced at Reyes, who had emerged from the helicopter and was standing at the edge of the floodlit circle. He met her eyes and nodded once. He had told them everything. The deliberate isolation, the withheld support, the expectation of failure. This is not over, Calhoun said, his voice tight. I will be filing a formal report. As will I, Colonel Bautista replied. I suspect the review board will find my account quite interesting. Calhoun turned and walked away without another word. His shoulders were stiff, his stride too fast. He looked like a man who had just realized that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. Major Henderson watched him go, then turned back to Talia. Get some rest, Corporal. There will be debriefs tomorrow. But tonight, you should know that what you accomplished matters. The people who needed to see it have seen it. She nodded, too exhausted for words. The Major and the Colonel moved away, already speaking in low tones about reports and reviews and the bureaucratic machinery that would now begin to turn. Reyes appeared at her side. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a steady presence in the chaos of a landing zone. You told him, she said finally. About Calhoun. He shrugged. I told the truth. That is all. She looked at him. In the harsh floodlights, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the same exhaustion she felt in her own bones. They had survived something together. That created a bond that did not require explanation. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me yet. He allowed himself a small smile. The paperwork for this is going to be terrible. Despite everything, she laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it was real. The first real laugh she had managed in days. The reckoning had begun, but for the first time since she had arrived at this unit, she was not facing it alone. The debriefs lasted 3 days. Talia sat in windowless rooms and answered questions from intelligence officers, legal advisors, and commanders whose names she forgot as soon as they introduced themselves. She described the storm surge. She described the competing sniper team. She described every decision she had made and why she had made it. She did not embellish. She did not justify. She simply told the truth and let the truth speak for itself. On the second day, Lance Corporal Derek Yoon requested permission to provide a statement. He was her original spotter, the one Calhoun had reassigned at the last minute to leave her without support. His testimony was damning. He described Calhoun's pattern of behavior over the preceding months. The worst assignments given to female Marines. The deliberately withheld resources. The comments made when he thought no one important was listening. Unit kept notes, dates, times, witnesses. He had been building a case long before Talia ever arrived at the unit. She learned this from Major Henderson, who pulled her aside after the morning session on day 2. Yoon came forward on his own, the Major said. He has been documenting Calhoun's conduct for almost a year. Your mission gave him the evidence he needed to make it official. Why did he wait? Talia asked. Because he needed proof that Calhoun's behavior had operational consequences. The Major's expression was grim. A hostile work environment is one thing. Getting a Marine killed through deliberate sabotage is something else entirely. Your survival and success made the case impossible to ignore. She thought about Yun. She had barely spoken to him before the mission. He had seemed like just another member of Calhoun's inner circle, another face in a unit that had made clear she was not welcome. She had been wrong. On the third day, the investigation concluded. Talia was cleared of any wrongdoing. Her actions were deemed consistent with mission objectives and the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. The report used phrases like exceptional initiative and remarkable adaptability under extreme conditions. It did not mention that she was the first woman to complete a scout sniper mission in active combat. Some things were better left unwritten. Calhoun was reassigned pending a formal review board. He would not face court-martial. The evidence was damning, but not quite damning enough for that. Instead, he would be transferred to a training command stateside, his career effectively over, his path to promotion permanently blocked. He would spend his remaining years in the Corps teaching skills he would never again be trusted to employ. She saw him once, on the morning he departed. He was loading his gear into a vehicle outside the operations building when she walked past. Their eyes met. She expected anger. She expected bitterness. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like defeat. A man confronting the consequences of choices he had convinced himself were justified. She did not stop. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. He had made his decisions, and she had made hers. History would judge which of them had chosen correctly. That afternoon, Sergeant Reyes found her sitting alone behind the communications building, watching the sun set over the Philippine Sea. He sat down beside her without asking permission, the same way he had appeared in her debris pile when she needed him most. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. A rosary, the beads worn smooth by years of use, the crucifix tarnished with age. He pressed it into her palm. "This belonged to Maria," he said. "My cousin Lorna wanted you to have it." Talia looked at the rosary. The beads were warm from Reyes's pocket, warm from his body heat, warm from the life they represented. A 15-year-old girl who had been murdered by a man who would never hurt anyone again. "I cannot accept this," she said. "You already have." Reyes smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Lorna says Maria would have wanted it to go to the person who brought her justice. She says her daughter can rest now. She says you gave her that." Talia closed her fingers around the rosary. The beads pressed into her skin, small points of pressure that felt like connection, like meaning, like the reason she had survived everything the past 3 days had thrown at her. "Thank you," she said. The words fell inadequate, but they were all she had. Reyes nodded. He was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Then he spoke again. "I have been thinking about your father, about what you told me while we were waiting in the debris." She had told him very little, just fragments. The hurricane, the water, the last time she saw him smile. "You said he taught you to read storms," Reyes continued, "to understand what the water wanted, to survive by respecting forces you could not control." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I think he would be proud of you." He looked at her directly now, his expression open and honest. "I think he would look at what you did, at who you have become, and he would know that his sacrifice was not wasted. You did not just survive the storm, Talia. You became someone who helps others survive." She felt the tears before she could stop them. They ran down her cheeks, silent and unstoppable, carrying with them the weight of 16 years of grief that she had never fully allowed herself to feel. She cried for her father. She cried for Maria. She cried for the 10-year-old girl who had watched the water take everything she loved and somehow found the strength to keep living. Reyes did not try to comfort her. He simply sat beside her, a quiet presence, letting her feel what she needed to feel. Some griefs were too deep for words. They could only be witnessed. When the tears finally stopped, she reached in her own pocket and withdrew her father's compass. The brass was warm against her fingers. She had carried it through every storm since Katrina. It had been with her in the mangroves, pressed against her chest, guiding her even when she could not see the way forward. She held it out to Reyes. I want you to have this, she said. He looked at the compass, then at her. I cannot take that. It was your father's, and now it is yours. She pressed it into his palm, the same way he had pressed the rosary into hers. You helped me find my way through the storm. You came for me when no one else would. This compass has been waiting its whole life to belong to someone like you. Reyes looked at the compass for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with emotion he did not try to hide. I will carry it always, he said. The sun disappeared below the horizon. The sky faded from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. They sat together in the growing darkness, two people who had found each other in the worst circumstances imaginable and emerged with something neither of them had expected. Tomorrow she would board a transport plane back to the States. Tomorrow the distance between them would begin to grow. But tonight, in this moment, they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The storm had passed. What remained was something that felt like peace. 6 months later, Talia stood at the front of a classroom at the Scout Sniper School, watching 12 candidates file in for their first day of advanced training. They moved with the nervous energy of Marines who had already proven themselves once and now faced the challenge of proving themselves again. 3 of them were women. She let them settle into their seats before she spoke. Welcome to the precision marksmanship phase of your training. I am Sergeant Voss. I will be your primary instructor for the next 8 weeks. She saw the recognition flicker across several faces. Her name had traveled through the Corps in the months since the Philippines, carried by rumors and official reports and the quiet network of Marines who shared stories about their own. She had not sought the attention. She had not wanted it, but she understood its value. Every woman in this room had heard some version of what she had done, and that knowledge gave them something they desperately needed. Proof that it was possible. She continued, You are here because you have demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions are a lie. The moment you leave this building, nothing will ever be controlled again. Weather will work against you. Equipment will fail. Leadership will make decisions you do not understand. Your job is to complete your mission anyway. The candidates watched her with the focused attention of people who understood that every word might matter. Over the next 8 weeks, I will teach you how to build a hide that can survive conditions you cannot imagine. I will teach you how to calculate a shot when your scope is damaged, your hands are shaking, and your target is not cooperating. I will teach you how to think when thinking seems impossible. And I will teach you the most important skill a sniper can possess. She paused, letting the silence build. Patience. The patience to wait for the right moment, no matter how long it takes. The patience to rebuild when everything you have built is destroyed. The patience to trust yourself when no one else does. She looked at the 3 women in the room. They looked back at her with expressions that mixed determination with something that might have been hope. Any questions before we begin? One of the women raised her hand. A lance corporal with sharp eyes and the calloused hands of someone who had spent serious time on the range. Sergeant Voss, is it true that you rebuilt your hide 3 times during a single mission? Talia considered the question. The true answer was complicated. The simplified answer was more useful. I rebuilt my position as many times as necessary to complete the mission. That is what this training will prepare you to do. Not to succeed under perfect conditions. To succeed under the worst conditions you can imagine, and then conditions worse than that. The lance corporal nodded, satisfied. Talia saw something shift in her posture. A straightening of the spine, a settling of the shoulders, the physical manifestation of belief taking root. She began the first lesson. The weeks passed in a rhythm of instruction and evaluation. She pushed the candidates hard, harder than she had been pushed, because she knew what waited for them beyond these walls. She watched them struggle and adapt and grow. She watched some of them fail and leave with their heads down. She watched others discover capabilities they had not known they possessed. The 3 women remained. They were not the top performers in every category. They did not need to be. They were competent, professional, and determined. They belonged here, and every day they stayed proved it to everyone watching. On the final day of the course, after the graduation ceremony, after the handshakes and photographs and official congratulations, Talia found herself alone on the training range. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of the Philippines. She raised her rifle and sighted on a distant target, more from habit than necessity. The shot was perfect. It always was now. The months of instruction had honed her skills even sharper than before. But it was not the shooting that had changed her. It was everything else. Footsteps behind her. She lowered the rifle and turned. Sergeant Reyes stood at the edge of the range, wearing civilian clothes and a smile she had not seen in 6 months. He looked good, rested, different from the exhausted man who had crawled through a storm surge to save her life. "You're a long way from home," she said. "I had business in the States. Joint training coordination." He walked toward her, his movements easy and unhurried. "I thought I would stop by and see how you were doing." She set her rifle down and closed the distance between them. For a moment, they simply stood there, two people reconnecting after a separation that had felt longer than it was. "How is Lorna?" she asked. "She is well. She has started a foundation in Maria's name. Scholarships for girls in Basilan who want to continue their education. She says it helps her feel like Maria's life still matters." Talia touched the rosary she wore beneath her uniform. Maria's rosary, which had not left her body since the night Reyes placed it in her hand. "It does matter," she said. "It all matters." Reyes reached into his pocket and withdrew her father's compass. The brass caught the fading sunlight, glowing warm and golden. "I have carried this every day," he said. "It has guided me through some difficult moments. But I've been thinking that it might be time to return it." She shook her head. "It belongs to you now. Perhaps." He turned the compass over in his hand. "Or perhaps it belongs to whoever needs it most. And I think there is someone in your training class who might need it more than I do." She thought about the lance corporal with the sharp eyes, the one who had asked about rebuilding, the one who reminded her of herself at that age, hungry and determined and terrified of being seen as less than. "There might be," she admitted. Reyes pressed the compass into her palm. "Then let it find its way to her. That is what your father would want. That is what compasses are for." She looked at the compass. Her father's compass. The last physical connection to the man who had taught her everything she needed to survive. Passing it on felt like letting go of something essential. It also felt like the right thing to do. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about what resonated most with you. Maybe you know someone who rebuilt after the storm, or a woman who proved the doubters wrong. Drop a comment and tell us about them. The sun slipped below the horizon. Talia and Reyes walked back toward the main buildings together, their conversation easy, their silence comfortable. They talked about the future, training programs, joint exercises, the possibility of working together again. They did not talk about the storm. They did not need to. The storm was behind them now. What lay ahead was everything they would build in its wake. That night, alone in her quarters, Talia held the compass one final time. She thought about her father's hands showing her how to read the needle. She thought about his voice teaching her to navigate by stars and instinct and faith. She thought about the last time she saw his face, disappearing beneath the flood waters of Hurricane Katrina. He had given her everything she needed, not just the compass, not just the skills. He had given her the understanding that survival was not about avoiding the storm. It was about rebuilding after the storm passed. Again and again and again. Tomorrow she would find the lance corporal and press the compass into her palm. She would tell her about the man who had carried it first. She would tell her about the woman who had carried it through the Philippines. She would tell her that the compass was not just a tool for finding direction. It was a promise that the storms would come, and the storms would destroy, and somehow, if you were patient and determined and willing to rebuild, you would find your way through. The compass would continue its journey. The legacy would continue to grow. And somewhere, Talia believed her father was watching, proud of who she had become, proud of what she had survived, proud of the Marines she would help create. The storm had taken everything from her twice. First in Louisiana, then in the Philippines. But storms pass. They always pass. And when they do, you assess the damage. You salvage what you can. You rebuild. And you keep your rifle ready. Because another storm is always coming. And Sergeant Talia Voss would be ready.